Picture this. A picturesque Greek island, crystal blue waters lapping against ancient shores, where fairy tales are supposed to come true. It is here that 15-year-old Caroline Crouch first looked up at the sky and saw him, a handsome pilot in his helicopter, circling above her school like something out of a romantic movie. What started as every teenage girl's dream would end in a nightmare that shocked the world. On a quiet May morning in 2021, emergency services received a desperate call from the suburbs of Athens. The voice on the other end was barely recognizable, muffled by duct tape, choking out words that would launch one of Greece's most notorious murder investigations. Robbers came in, the man gasped through his restraints, his infant daughter crying in the background, his young wife lying dead beside their bed. This is the story of Caroline Crouch, a case that would expose the dark underbelly of domestic violence, challenge our assumptions about fairy tale romance, and reveal how easily the world can be deceived by a carefully constructed lie. It is a chilling true story that reminds us that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers in the night, but from those we trust most. Before we dive deeper into this investigative documentary, if you're fascinated by real crime stories like this, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're rewatching from. I love connecting with fellow true crime enthusiasts from around the world. The helicopter first appeared over Alanissos on a warm spring day in 2017, its rotors cutting through the Mediterranean air like something from a Hollywood romance. For the students at the local school, it was an unusual sight. Helicopters rarely visited their quiet Greek island, a place where time seemed to move at the pace of the tides. But for 15-year-old Caroline Crouch, watching from the schoolyard with her classmates, that helicopter represented something magical. Something that would change the course of her life forever. Caroline had been living on Alanissos since she was 8 years old, when her parents, David Crouch and Susan Della Costa, fell in love with the island's coastal beauty and decided to make it their permanent home. David, a retired engineer, and Susan had found their paradise in this small community where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest excitement was usually the arrival of the weekly ferry bringing supplies from the mainland. For Caroline, it had been an idyllic childhood, swimming in crystal clear waters, learning to scuba dive among ancient ruins, embracing the freedom that island life provided. But adolescence brings with it dreams of something bigger, something more exciting than the quiet rhythms of island existence. Caroline was a bright, athletic girl who excelled at kickboxing and carried herself with the confidence of someone comfortable in the water and on land. She was bilingual, moving effortlessly between Greek and English, embodying the multicultural identity that defines so many modern Mediterranean communities. Her parents had given her roots, but she was beginning to develop wings. The man piloting that helicopter was Charlambos Anagnostopoulos, though everyone called him Babis. At 27, he was already an established commercial helicopter pilot, financially stable and undeniably charismatic. His family had connections to Alanissos. His mother had been a teacher on the island, which gave him a legitimate reason to be there, to be circling above the school where Caroline studied. But there was something calculated about his presence that day, something that would only become clear years later when investigators began piecing together the psychological profile of a man who understood how to manipulate both machines and people. The age difference between them was stark and problematic by any modern standard. 20-7-year-old man pursuing a 15-year-old girl. Yet, in the close-knit community of Alanissos, where traditional values often conflicted with contemporary concerns about appropriate relationships, Babis presented himself as a respectable suitor. He was well-educated, financially secure, and came from a known family. In Greek culture, particularly in smaller communities, such considerations often outweighed concerns about age gaps that might raise immediate red flags in urban environments. Caroline was flattered by the attention. Here was a sophisticated older man who seemed to offer everything a teenage girl might dream of: adventure, financial security, and escape from the limitations of island life. Babis was charming and persistent, showing up at social events, the annual Good Friday parade where they officially met, making himself a fixture in the community's social fabric. He understood how to present himself as the perfect gentleman while systematically isolating his target from potential warning voices. The relationship developed with the kind of intensity that often characterizes inappropriate age gap romances. Caroline, still developing her sense of self and her understanding of healthy relationships, found herself swept up in what felt like a fairy tale romance. Babis showered her with attention, gifts, and promises of a future together. He painted pictures of their life after she finished school, traveling together, building a home, creating the kind of life that seemed impossibly glamorous to a teenager living on a small Greek island. What Caroline couldn't see, what her family and community couldn't fully understand, was that this wasn't love, it was grooming. Bobbis was systematically conditioning her to depend on him emotionally, financially, and socially. The helicopter rides, the expensive gifts, the constant attention, these were UNA expressions of genuine affection, but tools in a campaign to capture and control a vulnerable young person. This pattern of behavior represents a dark history that repeats itself across cultures and generations, where older men exploit the natural dreams and aspirations of young women for their own purposes. By the time Caroline turned 18, she was completely under Bobbis's influence. The proposal came just as she reached the age of legal consent, a timing that was almost certainly calculated rather than coincidental. They married in Portugal in July 2019, far from family and friends, in what Bobbis presented as a romantic elopement, but would actually serve to further isolate Caroline from her support network. Traditional Greek weddings are community affairs, celebrations that involve extended family and friends, opportunities for loved ones to express concerns or reservations. Eloping. Bobbis ensured that no one would have the chance to question their relationship or offer Caroline alternative perspectives on her life choices. The newlyweds settled in Glika, a suburb on the outskirts of Athens, where Bobbis could continue his career as a pilot while Caroline enrolled in college. From the outside, their life looked perfect. Their social media presence was carefully curated to project happiness and success, photos of Caroline in beautiful locations, images of their comfortable home, glimpses of a lifestyle that many their age might envy. Bobbis understood the power of perception in the digital age, how the right photographs could create a narrative that obscured more troubling realities. But behind the carefully constructed facade, Caroline was living a very different reality. Her diary entries from this period, which would later become crucial evidence in understanding her psychological state, tell the story of a young woman trapped in an increasingly controlling and manipulative relationship. The isolation that began with their elopement continued and intensified once they were married. Bobbis controlled the finances, monitoring Caroline's spending and limiting her independence. He discouraged her from maintaining close friendships, creating situations where she became increasingly dependent on him for social interaction and emotional support. The birth of their daughter in 2020 should have been a joyful milestone, but for Caroline, it represented another chain binding her to a relationship that was causing her increasing distress. Her diary entries from this period revealed the internal conflict of a young mother who loved her child desperately, but felt trapped in a marriage that was destroying her sense of self. She wrote about wanting to leave but feeling unable to do so, caught between her love for her daughter and her growing recognition that her relationship with Bobbis was fundamentally unhealthy. Greece in 2021 was a country still recovering from a devastating financial crisis that had shaken public confidence in institutions and created a climate of general anxiety about security and stability. The economic upheaval had left many Greeks distrustful of banks, leading to the common practice of keeping significant amounts of cash at home, a cultural detail that would become crucial to understanding the events of May 11th. Caroline and Bobbis had recently purchased land with plans to build their dream home using 50,000 euros gifted by Caroline as parents combined, with their own savings of 10,000 euros hidden in their house, tucked away in an old Monopoly box, like so many other Greek families who preferred cash to the uncertainty of financial institutions. The stage was now set for a tragedy that would shock not just Greece, but the international community. A crime that would expose the dangerous intersection of domestic violence, social media deception, and the vulnerability of young women caught in controlling relationships. Caroline Krosch, now 20 years old, and the mother of an 11-month-old daughter, was planning to leave her husband. She had made hotel reservations, sent texts to friends about her intentions, and was finally ready to break free from the golden cage that had trapped her since she was a teenager. She had no way of knowing that her husband was monitoring her communications, tracking her plans, and preparing to ensure that she would never have the chance to escape him. The fairy tale was about to become a nightmare, and the world was about to witness one of the most elaborate deceptions in modern criminal history. The first signs of dawn were still hours away when terror came calling on Folgandou Street in Glika. At exactly 4:30 in the morning on May 11th, 2021, What appeared to be a carefully orchestrated home invasion began to unfold in the quiet suburb outside Athens. But this was no ordinary burglary. This was the opening act of a performance so convincing that it would fool experienced investigators, international media, and millions of people around the world for more than a month. According to the story that would soon captivate Greece and beyond, 3 hooded intruders had approached the 2-story house through a dirt road leading to the rear entrance. Unable to break through the back door, they had supposedly removed security pins from a basement window and squeezed through the narrow opening. Their first act of violence, as the story would go, was the murder of Roxy, the family's 7-month-old husky puppy, strangled with her own leash and left hanging from the staircase. As a grisly warning of the brutality to come, the intruders, speaking in Greek and Albanian accents, had then made their way to the main bedroom where Babis and Carolyn lay sleeping with their 11-month-old daughter. Armed with both a black pistol and a silver Colt, they overpowered Babis quickly, binding him with rope and covering his eyes and mouth with duct tape. The restraints around his neck were so tight that he drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the ordeal, helpless to protect his wife and child from the violence that was about to unfold. Carolyn, according to this version of events, had fought back with the skills she'd learned as a black belt kickboxer, but she was outnumbered and outgunned. The intruders demanded money, and when Caroline claimed ignorance, they turned their weapons on the infant daughter, holding a gun to the baby's temple until Babis revealed the location of their savings. The money was hidden in an old Monopoly box, 10,000 euros intended for the construction of their dream home, plus additional cash and jewelry worth another 20,000 euros. But even after obtaining what they came for, the intruders didn't leave. They ransacked the house, searching for additional valuables, creating the kind of chaos typically associated with desperate criminals looking for anything they could sell or trade. During this rampage, they removed the memory card from the security camera in the living room and continued to terrorize the family for what seemed like an eternity. The final act of this supposed invasion was the most brutal, with Babis, bound and helpless, drifting in and out of consciousness from the tightness of his restraints. The intruders murdered Carolyn by pressing a pillow over her face and suffocating her. The attack lasted approximately 6 minutes, during which a young mother fought for her life while her infant daughter lay nearby and her bound husband was powerless to intervene. The psychological trauma of such an experience would be unimaginable for any survivor. When the intruders finally left, believing they had killed both adults and left no witnesses behind, Babis found himself alone with his crying daughter and his dead wife. It took him 30 minutes to work his way across the floor to his mobile phone, using his nose to dial emergency services. The call, muffled by the duct tape still covering his mouth, was heart-wrenching in its desperation. Babis came in, he managed to say, his words barely comprehensible through the restraints. The first responders who arrived at 6 o'clock that morning encountered a scene of devastating brutality. The house had been destroyed, with drawers pulled open and contents scattered everywhere. The security camera lay on the living room couch, its memory card missing. Most horrifically, they found Roxy's body hanging from the staircase, a senseless act of cruelty that suggested the intruders were not merely thieves but individuals capable of extreme violence against innocent victims. In the main bedroom, they discovered Babis still bound on the floor, his restraints so tight that he bore physical marks from his struggle against them. On the bed lay Caroline, face down, with her daughter beside her, crying and trying to wake her mother with small hands that could understand why mommy would unrespond. The image of that 11-month-old child, unharmed but traumatized, trying to rouse her dead mother became one of the most haunting aspects of the entire case. The initial investigation proceeded exactly as one would expect for such a brutal home invasion. Police determined that 4 men had been involved, 3 inside the house and 1 keeping watch outside. They theorized that the criminals had cased the property beforehand, knowing about the family's cash reserves and planning their attack for maximal effect. The violence against the family pet suggested psychological instability or calculated attempt to terrorize the victims into compliance. Physical evidence seemed to support this theory. One of the intruders had left behind a hood, apparently dropped during the struggle with Babis. Based on the brief glimpse Babis had gotten when the hood fell off, police created a sketch of a tall, overweight, dark-skinned individual. Babis also provided detailed descriptions of the weapons used, information that would prove crucial in the search for the perpetrators. The brutality and apparent professionalism of the attack led investigators to conclude that this was the work of an organized criminal group, possibly with connections to the Albanian mafia that operated in the Athens area. The fact that the intruders spoke both Greek and Albanian accents supported this theory, as did the methodical nature of the crime. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, but a carefully planned operation, carried out by individuals who knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. In the days following the murder, the story captured international attention. Here was a case that seemed to embody every homeowner's worst nightmare: criminals breaking into a family home in the dead of night, terrorizing innocent victims, and committing senseless violence that went far beyond simple robbery. The image of Caroline Crouch, a beautiful young mother murdered in her own bed while her infant daughter lay nearby, resonated with people around the world who saw in her story their own vulnerability to random violence. Greek society was particularly shaken by the case. The country had been experiencing rising concerns about crime, particularly crimes involving foreign criminal organizations. The brutal nature of Caroline's murder, combined with the senseless killing of the family pet, seemed to represent a new level of callousness that many Greeks found deeply disturbing. Public demands for justice were immediate and intense. Babis, meanwhile, played the role of the grieving widower with conviction that impressed everyone who encountered him. He cooperated fully with police, providing detailed descriptions of the attackers and their methods. He spoke to journalists about his loss, expressing both grief for his wife and determination to see her killers brought to justice. His social media presence during this period showed a man devastated by tragedy, but committed to keeping his wife's memory alive and caring for their orphan daughter. The investigation initially proceeded along predictable lines. Police began searching for the criminal organization responsible, focusing on Albanian crime groups known to operate in the Athens area. They compiled lists of suspects, showed photographs to Babis for identification, and followed up on tips from the public. A substantial reward was offered for information leading to the arrest of Caroline's killers. But despite the high-profile nature of the case, no credible leads emerged. The first major break seemed to come just 3 days after Caroline's funeral, when police stopped a car near the Bulgarian border and discovered a Georgian national traveling with false documents. Georgi Haraskeli was a career criminal with a history of violent home invasions, including several in the Athens area that bore striking similarities to the attack on Caroline and Babis. 3 of his previous crimes had occurred in their neighborhood, including one in December that involved breaking through a rear window and threatening to slit a female victim's throat. The parallels were too strong to ignore. Haraskeli matched the physical description from the police sketch, had a history of exactly the type of crime that had occurred at the Anagnostopolis home, and had been attempting to flee the country when captured. Police were confident they had found their man and subjected him to intensive interrogation for 4 days, even using physical coercion in their determination to extract a confession. But despite the pressure, Haraskeli maintained his innocence, claiming he had never heard of Caroline Crouch and had no involvement in her murder. When investigators couldn't produce concrete evidence linking him to the crime, they were forced to release him. The embarrassment of arresting the wrong suspect led to the demotion of 3 officers from the Athens homicide squad and left the investigation back at square one. As spring turned to summer and the case remained unsolved, public anxiety in Athens began to grow. Residents were installing additional security systems, changing their routines, and living with a constant fear that they might be next. The fact that professional investigators had been unable to solve such a high-profile case despite having physical evidence and eyewitness testimony suggested that the criminals were either extremely sophisticated or had inside knowledge that allowed them to stay ahead of the investigation. Media coverage began to shift from sympathy for the victims to criticism of the police investigation. Experts suggested that this was no ordinary home invasion, that the level of planning and execution indicated criminal expertise beyond typical street gangs or drug addicts looking for quick cash. Some theorized that the crime was connected to larger criminal organizations with the resources and knowledge to carry out such elaborate operations while avoiding detection. Caroline's family, meanwhile, continued to grieve publicly while supporting the investigation. Babis remained active in media appearances, social media posts, and public appeals for information. He presented himself as a man determined to find justice for his wife while protecting and caring for their daughter. His apparent dedication to keeping Carolina's memory alive won him sympathy and support from the Greek public, and the international community following the case. But beneath the surface of this compelling narrative, inconsistencies were beginning to emerge that would eventually unravel one of the most sophisticated deceptions in modern criminal history. The investigation was about to take a turn that would shock everyone involved and reveal a truth far more disturbing than the random violence it was meant to conceal. 37 days after Carolyn Crouch was murdered, the case took a dramatic and unexpected turn that would forever change how the world viewed this tragic story. On June 17, 2021, what began as a simple memorial service on the peaceful island of Alanissos ended with one of the most stunning arrests in Greek criminal history. The transformation of victim into suspect happened so quietly that most of the mourners gathered to honor Carolina's memory had no idea they were witnessing the final moments of one of the most elaborate deceptions ever perpetrated on the international stage. The memorial service itself had been a touching affair, with friends and family gathering to remember the young woman whose life had been cut short by what everyone believed was a brutal home invasion. Babis was there, playing the role of the grieving widower with the same conviction he had maintained throughout the investigation. He spoke of his love for Carolyn, his commitment to raising their daughter alone, and his determination to see her killers brought to justice. To everyone present, he appeared to be a man destroyed by loss, but strengthened by purpose. What the mourners didn't know was that investigators had been watching Babis carefully throughout the service, looking for any signs of deception or guilty knowledge. The detective team had spent weeks analyzing every detail of the crime scene, every piece of evidence, every statement Babis had made about that terrible night. And slowly, methodically, they had begun to uncover inconsistencies that didn't fit the narrative of a home invasion gone wrong. The breakthrough had come from technology that Babis never considered when staging his elaborate deception. Caroline's smartwatch, which monitored her heart rate and sleep patterns, had recorded data that told a very different story than the one Babis had presented to police. The device showed that Caroline's heart rate had spiked dramatically at 3:58 a.m., indicating severe physical and emotional distress, and had stopped entirely at 4:11 a.m. This was significantly earlier than the timeline Babis had given for the supposed home invasion, creating a discrepancy that investigators could not ignore. Similarly, the fitness app on Babis's smartphone had recorded his movements throughout the night, showing activity during the time he claimed to be bound and helpless. The data painted a picture of someone moving around the house, not lying tied up on the bedroom floor. When investigators attempted to recreate the process of calling emergency services with 1's nose while bound and gagged, they found it virtually impossible to achieve the clarity and coherence that characterized Babis's distress call. The security camera evidence provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. While Babis claimed that the intruders had removed a memory card to cover their tracks, digital forensics revealed that the card had actually been removed at 1:20 a.m., hours before the supposed breaking occurred. This suggested that someone with legitimate access to the house had disabled the camera system as part of pre-planning, not as a reaction to an ongoing crime. Physical evidence at the scene also began to tell a different story under closer scrutiny. The basement window that Babis claimed the intruders had used to enter the house was far too small for someone matching the physical description he had provided. The neighbors, when carefully interviewed, reported hearing no sounds of a house being ransacked or victims calling for help. Only the distressed cries of the family's puppy, consistent with the animal being killed, but inconsistent with a prolonged home invasion involving multiple perpetrators and terrorized victims. Perhaps most damning of all was the discovery of Carolina's digital communications in the hours and days before her death. Investigators found evidence that she had been planning to leave Babis, including hotel reservations made for herself and her daughter. Text messages to friends revealed her intentions to escape what had become an increasingly controlling and abusive relationship. Caroline had also been researching divorce procedures and had begun taking steps to establish her independence from her husband. The psychological profile of the crime also raised questions that experienced investigators couldn't ignore. Why would professional criminals, sophisticated enough to plan and execute a complex home invasion, waste time murdering a family pet? Why would they engage in the kind of prolonged torture and terrorization that served no practical purpose in a robbery? Why would they kill a young mother who posed no real threat to their escape when they could have simply taken the money and left? As investigators dug deeper into Babis's background, they discovered a pattern of controlling behavior that extended far beyond the normal dynamics of their age gap relationship. Caroline's diary entries, recovered from their home, painted a picture of systematic psychological abuse, financial control, and emotional manipulation. The entries revealed a young woman who felt trapped in a relationship that had begun when she was a vulnerable teenager and had gradually evolved into something that resembled psychological captivity more than marriage. The diary entries were particularly heartbreaking in their revelation of Caroline's internal struggle. She wrote repeatedly about loving Bobbis, but feeling hurt by their relationship, about wanting to leave but feeling unable to do so, especially after their daughter was born. Her words describe the classic psychology of domestic abuse victims, women who find themselves trapped not by physical chains but by emotional manipulation, financial dependence, and concern for their children's welfare. One entry, dated July 2020, was especially poignant. "Today my little one is a month old. It's also the day I told Bobbis I want to leave. I feel awful." Another revealed her reasoning for staying. "I stayed with him so my daughter would not grow up without her two parents." These entries documented Caroline's growing awareness that her marriage was destructive, while simultaneously showing her internal conflict about how to protect her daughter while protecting herself. Phone records from the night of the murder revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Caroline and Bobbis had been exchanging argumentative and combative text messages, while both were at home together, indicating that their relationship had reached a crisis point. The content of these messages, combined with Caroline's preparations to leave, suggested that Bobbis had become aware of her plans and was facing the prospect of losing both his wife and his daughter, a scenario that his controlling personality could not accept. When detectives approached Bobbis at the memorial service and asked him to accompany them back to Athens for further questioning, he complied without apparent concern. He seemed confident that his deception had been successful, that the investigation would continue to focus on finding the Albanian criminals he had invented. But when confronted with the overwhelming evidence of his deception, his carefully constructed facade finally began to crumble. The interrogation lasted 8 hours, during which investigators presented Bobbis with each piece of contradictory evidence, each inconsistency in his story, each technological proof that his version of events was impossible. They showed him the smartwatch data that proved Caroline had died earlier than he claimed. They presented the phone records showing his movement when he should have been immobilized. They confronted him with Carolina's communications about leaving him and the digital trail of her preparations for independence. For hours, Bobbis maintained his innocence, continuing to insist that home invaders had murdered his wife. But as the evidence mounted and the contradictions in his story became undeniable, he finally began to break down. The confession, when it came, was both shocking in its admission of guilt and disturbing in its attempt to shift blame onto his victim. According to Bobbis's confession, the murder had begun as an argument on the night of May 10th, triggered by Caroline's determination to leave him and take their daughter. He claimed that Caroline had become physically aggressive, pushing and punching him, and that her behavior had caused him to lose control. He described strangling her and pressing a pillow over her face with his full body weight, killing her while their 11-month-old daughter lay nearby. But even in confession, Bobbis continued to manipulate the narrative, portraying himself as a victim of circumstances rather than a calculating killer. He claimed that Caroline's desire to leave had made him unstable and aggressive, suggesting that her attempts to escape an abusive relationship had somehow justified his decision to murder her. This attempt to blame the victim even while confessing to her murder revealed the depth of his narcissistic personality and his inability to accept responsibility for his actions. After killing Caroline, Bobbis had spent hours staging the elaborate home invasion scene. He had killed Roxy, the family puppy, hanging her from the staircase to add credibility to the story of violent intruders. He had ransacked his own home, scattering belongings and creating the appearance of a desperate search for valuables. He had removed the security camera's memory card and planted the hood that would later mislead investigators. Finally, he had placed his infant daughter next to her mother as corpse and tied himself up with rope and duct tape before calling for help. The sophistication of the deception was staggering in its callousness. Not only had Bobbis murdered his wife, but he had used their baby daughter as a prop in his staged crime scene, leaving her alone with her mother's body while he prepared his false story. The image of an 11-month-old child crying and trying to wake her dead mother while her father methodically created evidence to frame innocent people. For the crime represents a level of cruelty that defies comprehension. The confession sent shockwaves through Greece and around the world. For more than a month, millions of people had followed this case, sympathizing with what they believed was a grieving widower and his orphaned daughter. The international media had presented Bobbis as a tragic figure, a man whose fairy tale romance had ended in unthinkable violence. The revelation that he had been the perpetrator all along forced a complete reevaluation of everything the public thought they knew about domestic violence, deception, and the power of carefully constructed lies. The case became known as the murder that fooled the world, a designation that captured both the international attention it had received and the comprehensive nature of Bobbis' deception. Criminal psychologists and law enforcement experts began studying the case as an example of how domestic abusers can manipulate not just their victims, but entire communities, legal systems, and media organizations. The sophisticated nature of the staging raised questions about how many other unsolved crimes might actually be elaborate deceptions designed to conceal domestic violence. For Greece, the case represented a profound national embarrassment. The country's law enforcement agencies had been completely fooled by Bobbis' performance, pursuing innocent suspects while the real perpetrator continued his charade in front of international cameras. The fact that 3 police officers had to be demoted for their aggressive investigation of Georgie Her highlighted how the deception had compromised the entire investigative process. But beyond the embarrassment was a deeper reckoning with the cultural attitudes that had enabled this tragedy. The case forced Greek society to confront uncomfortable questions about age gap relationships, about the grooming of teenage girls by older men, and about the warning signs of domestic abuse that had been overlooked or rationalized away. Carolina's story became a symbol of how young women can be systematically isolated and controlled by predatory partners, trapped in relationships that appear loving from the outside while being psychologically destructive within. The international attention the case received also sparked broader conversations about domestic violence in the social media age, about how carefully curated online personas can hide systematic abuse, and about the way modern technology can be used both to conceal crimes and to ultimately reveal the truth. Caroline and Bobbis' social media presence had painted a picture of happiness and success that bore no resemblance to the reality documented in her private diary, illustrating how digital platforms can become tools of deception and abusive relationships. As Bobbis was led away in handcuffs, the world began to grapple with the implications of his elaborate lie. The case had revealed not just the actions of one murderer, but the broader social, cultural, and technological factors that had enabled his deception to succeed for so long. The investigation had uncovered a truth far more disturbing than random violence. It had exposed the calculated cruelty of domestic abuse and the sophisticated methods modern killers can use to evade justice. The legal proceedings that followed Bobbis' confession would provide some measure of justice for Caroline, but they could not undo the damage his deception had caused or bring back the young mother whose life had been stolen by the very person who had promised to love and protect her. The case had ended, but its implications for understanding domestic violence, criminal deception, and the vulnerability of young women in controlling relationships would continue to resonate long after the headlines faded. The transformation of Charalambos and Agnostopoulos from grieving widower to confessed killer sent shockwaves through Greek society and reverberated around the world, forcing a complete reconsideration of a case that had captivated international attention for more than a month. But while Bobbis' arrests provided answers to the immediate questions surrounding Caroline's death, it also opened up deeper inquiries into the social, legal, and cultural factors that had enabled such an elaborate deception to succeed for so long. In the immediate aftermath of the confession, Greek law enforcement faced intense scrutiny both domestically and internationally. The fact that experienced investigators had been completely fooled by Bobbis' performance raised uncomfortable questions about the adequacy of investigative procedures, the reliability of eyewitness testimony, and the dangers of accepting initial narratives without sufficient skepticism. The aggressive pursuit of Georgie Haraskili, including the use of physical coercion during interrogation, highlighted systemic problems within the Greek police system that extended far beyond this single case. The media, both in Greece and internationally, also faced criticism for their role in amplifying Bobbis' deception. For weeks, journalists had presented him as a sympathetic figure, a loving husband and father destroyed by random violence. His carefully crafted social media presence and articulate media interviews had convinced experienced reporters and their audiences that his grief was genuine and his story was credible. The case became a stark reminder of how sophisticated manipulators can exploit media platforms and public sympathy to advance their deceptive narratives. The legal proceedings against Babis began in earnest following his confession, but the case presented unique challenges for prosecutors. While the confession provided clear evidence of guilt, the elaborate nature of the deception had contaminated much of the physical evidence and complicated efforts to present a coherent timeline of events. The initial crime scene investigation had been conducted under the assumption that multiple intruders were responsible, leading to collection and analysis protocols that were not optimized for a domestic murder staged as a home invasion. Forensic experts had to reconstruct the actual sequence of events from evidence that had been deliberately manipulated and contaminated. They had to distinguish between damage caused during the actual murder and damage inflicted afterward to support the false narrative. They had to analyze digital evidence that had been selectively preserved or destroyed to support Babis's story. The case became a masterclass in forensic investigation, requiring techniques and approaches that had rarely been necessary in more straightforward criminal cases. The psychological evaluation of Babis revealed a complex personality profile that helped explain both his ability to deceive investigators and his willingness to murder his wife. Mental health experts identified traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, including a grandiose sense of self-importance, a lack of empathy for others, and a willingness to exploit relationships for personal gain. These characteristics had enabled him to groom Caroline when she was a vulnerable teenager and to maintain control over her throughout their relationship. The evaluation also revealed Babis's sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate social systems and individual psychology. His performance as the grieving widower was not improvised, but reflected a calculated understanding of how to evoke sympathy and deflect suspicion. He had studied the investigation process closely enough to create physical evidence that would support his narrative while avoiding the kind of mistakes that typically expose false crime scene staging. Perhaps most disturbing was the revelation that Babis had shown no genuine remorse for Carlene's death. Even during his confession, his attempts to blame her for provoking the attack, his claims that her desire to leave had made him unstable and aggressive, revealed a fundamental inability to accept responsibility for his actions. Mental health experts noted that this pattern of victim blaming is characteristic of domestic abusers who cannot acknowledge that their controlling behavior drove their partners to seek escape. Caroline's family faced the devastating realization that the man they had trusted with their daughter's safety had been her killer all along. David Crouch and Susan Della Costa had welcomed Babis into their family, supported his relationship with their teenage daughter, and grieved alongside him after her death. The revelation that he had murdered Caroline while using their granddaughter as a prop in his deception added layers of trauma that would require years of healing to process. The custody of Caroline and Babis's daughter became a contentious legal issue that highlighted the broader implications of the case. With Babis facing life imprisonment, the child's maternal grandparents sought custody, arguing that she needed to be protected from any future contact with her father. The case raised complex questions about the rights of children whose parents are convicted of serious crimes and the responsibility of the legal system to protect innocent victims from ongoing trauma. Greek society grappled with uncomfortable questions about the cultural attitudes that had enabled Caroline's abuse and murder. The acceptance of their age gap relationship when Caroline was only 15 reflected broader patterns of tolerance for inappropriate relationships between older men and teenage girls. While such relationships are not uncommon in traditional Mediterranean cultures, Caroline's case forced many Greeks to confront the potential dangers of normalizing romantic relationships that begin when one partner is still a minor and the other is a fully formed adult with significant advantages in terms of experience, resources, and psychological development. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerabilities that young women face in the social media age, where carefully curated online personas can mask systematic abuse and isolation. Caroline's Instagram posts and Facebook updates had shown a seemingly happy life filled with travel, romance, and domestic bliss. But these images, investigators later realized, had been carefully controlled by Babis as part of his broader campaign to isolate her from potential sources of support and intervention. Domestic violence advocates seized upon Caroline's case as an example of how abuse can remain hidden even in plain sight, particularly when the abuser is sophisticated enough to maintain public respectability while systematically destroying his victim's autonomy and so. The case became a rallying point for organizations working to educate young women about the warning signs of controlling relationships. and the importance of maintaining connections to family and friends who can provide perspective and support. The Greek Orthodox Church, which had blessed Carolyn and Babas's marriage, faced difficult questions about its role in validating relationships that may be fundamentally problematic. Religious leaders began discussing the need for more comprehensive premarital counseling that addresses issues of age differences, power imbalances, and healthy relationship dynamics. The case sparked broader conversations within religious communities about their responsibility to protect vulnerable individuals from predatory relationships. The legal proceedings against Babas moved forward with unprecedented public attention, as the case had become a symbol of domestic violence, deception, and the failure of social institutions to protect vulnerable women. The trial, which began in 2022, presented prosecutors with the challenge of proving premeditation, while also addressing the elaborate deception that had initially misled investigators. The evidence presented at trial painted a comprehensive picture of a man who had systematically groomed, isolated, and ultimately murdered a young woman whose only crime was trying to escape his control. Prosecutors presented Carolyn's diary entries, which documented years of psychological abuse and her growing determination to leave the relationship. They showed digital evidence of her preparations for independence, including hotel reservations and communications with friends about her plans. The prosecution also presented evidence of Babas's elaborate cover, demonstrating the calculated nature of his deception. Expert witnesses testified about the impossibility of the home invasion scenario he had described, the inconsistencies in his timeline, and the sophisticated nature of his crime scene staging. The jury heard testimony about his manipulation of physical evidence, his use of his infant daughter as a prop in his deception, and his willingness to let innocent people be pursued for his crime. The defense attempted to argue that the murder had been a crime of passion rather than premeditation, hoping to reduce the charges and potential sentence. They presented Babas as a man who had been driven to temporary insanity by Carolyn's threats to leave with their daughter. But the evidence of extensive planning, both for the murder itself and for the subsequent made it difficult to sustain claims of spontaneous violence. The testimony of domestic violence experts proved crucial in helping the jury understand the psychology of abusive relationships and the pattern of escalation that often leads to lethal violence. These experts explained how controllers like Babas systematically isolate their victims, how they respond to threats of abandonment, and why women in such relationships often find it so difficult to leave safely. Carolyn's diary entries, read aloud in court, provided heartbreaking testimony from beyond the grave about the reality of her final years. Her words, written in private moments when she could express her true feelings, painted a picture of a young woman trapped in a relationship that was systematically destroying her sense of self. The entries documented her love for her daughter, her fear of Babas, and her growing determination to escape despite the obstacles he had placed in her path. The trial also addressed the broader social implications of the case, with expert witnesses testifying about the dangers of age gap relationships, the grooming of vulnerable teenagers, and the warning signs that family members and communities should watch for. The testimony served as an educational opportunity for a society grappling with how to better protect young women from predatory relationships. In May 2022, exactly 1 year after Carolyn's murder, Charalambos Anagnostaplis was found guilty on all charges: premeditated murder, obstructing the course of justice, lying to authorities, and animal abuse. The conviction brought a measure of legal closure to a case that had traumatized, and shocked the international community. But it could not undo the damage that Babas's elaborate deception had caused, or restore the life that Carolyn should have been able to live. The sentencing phase of the trial provided an opportunity for Carolyn's family to address the court and the public about the impact of their loss. David Crouch and Susan Della Costa spoke movingly about their daughter's dreams and aspirations about the life she had planned to build for herself and her daughter, and about the devastating impact of losing her to violence perpetrated by someone they had trusted and welcomed into their family. The judge's sentencing remarks addressed not only Babas's crimes, but also the broader social issues that the case had raised. The court noted the sophisticated nature of the deception, the callousness of using an infant child as a prop in a staged crime scene, and the particular cruelty of allowing innocent people to be pursued for a crime he had committed. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and the additional harm caused by the elaborate cover-up. Bobis received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 20 years, a sentence that reflected the court's recognition of the premeditated nature of the crime and the extensive planning that went into both the murder and the subsequent deception. The sentence also took into account the psychological abuse that had preceded the physical violence and the systematic way in which Bobis had destroyed Carolina's autonomy and independence. The conviction and sentencing marked the end of the legal proceedings, but the case continued to reverberate through Greek society and the international community. Carolina's story became a powerful symbol of the hidden nature of domestic violence and the particular vulnerabilities that young women face in controlling relationships. Her case sparked legislative discussions about strengthening protections for domestic violence victims and improving training for law enforcement officers who investigate such crimes. The case also had lasting implications for how crimes are investigated and how the media covers domestic violence cases. Law enforcement agencies around the world studied Bobis' deception techniques and developed new protocols for recognizing and investigating staged crime scenes. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting initial narratives without sufficient scrutiny and the importance of following physical evidence even when it contradicts compelling witness testimony. For Caroline's daughter, now being raised by her maternal grandparents, the case's resolution provided some measure of security, but could not erase the trauma of her early life. The child would grow up knowing that her father had murdered her mother, a burden that would require careful handling and professional support throughout her development. The case raised ongoing questions about how society should address the needs of children whose parents commit serious crimes and how to protect them from ongoing trauma, while ensuring they understand their family history. The legal victory, while significant, could not bring Caroline back or undo the years of abuse she had suffered. But it did provide a measure of justice, and, perhaps more importantly, it ensured that her story would serve as a warning to other young women who might find themselves in similar situations. The case became a powerful example of how domestic violence can escalate to murder and how sophisticated abusers can manipulate not just their victims but entire communities and legal systems. The aftermath of Bobis' conviction continued to generate important conversations about domestic violence, criminal deception, and the protection of vulnerable individuals in our society. Carolina's legacy would live on not just in her daughter but in the broader awareness her case had created about the hidden dangers that too many women face in their most intimate relationships. The conviction of Charalambos and Agnostopoulos marked not just the end of a criminal case, but the beginning of a broader reckoning with the social, cultural, and institutional factors that had enabled Caroline Crouch's murder and the elaborate deception that followed. In the months and years after the trial concluded, Caroline's story continued to resonate throughout Greece and around the world, becoming a powerful catalyst for change in how society addresses domestic violence, investigates complex crimes, and protects vulnerable young women from predatory relationships. The case's impact on Greek law enforcement was immediate and profound. Police departments across the country implemented new training protocols specifically designed to help investigators recognize staged crime scenes and identify inconsistencies in witness statements. The embarrassment of being deceived so completely by Bobis' performance led to a comprehensive review of investigative procedures, with particular attention to domestic violence cases that might be disguised as other types of crimes. The Greek police also adopted new technologies and analytical methods inspired by the Caroline Crouch investigation. The crucial role that digital evidence from smartwatch data to smartphone fitness apps had played in ultimately exposing Bobis' deception led to expanded training in digital forensics and the development of more sophisticated methods for analyzing electronic evidence in criminal cases. The case became a textbook example of how modern technology can both conceal and reveal criminal activity. International law enforcement agencies also studied the case extensively, recognizing that the sophisticated deception techniques Bobis had employed could be replicated by other criminals seeking to escape justice. The case was incorporated into training materials for police academies and investigative units around the world, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting initial narratives without sufficient scrutiny. The media's role in the case also came under intense scrutiny, leading to important conversations about responsible reporting on domestic violence cases. Journalists and media organizations recognized that their extensive sympathetic coverage of Bobis had inadvertently aided his deception, providing him with a platform to maintain his false narrative, while the real evidence was slowly coming to light. Major news outlets developed new editorial guidelines for covering domestic violence cases, emphasizing the importance of maintaining healthy skepticism even when dealing with apparently sympathetic victims or witnesses. The case highlighted how sophisticated manipulators can exploit media sympathy and public attention to advance their deceptive narratives, leading to more careful verification procedures and source authentication methods. Social media platforms also grappled with the implications of the case, particularly regarding how their services can be used to create false personas that mask systematic abuse. Caroline and Bob's carefully curated Instagram and Facebook presence had painted a picture of happiness and success that bore no resemblance to the reality documented in her private diary, illustrating how digital platforms can become tools of deception in abusive relationships. The case sparked important conversations about digital literacy and the need for young people to understand how social media can be manipulated to create false impressions. Educational programs began incorporating lessons about recognizing the signs of controlling behavior in digital communications and understanding that online personas may not reflect real-life relationships. Caroline's story became particularly powerful within the domestic violence advocacy community, where her case served as a tragic example of how abuse can remain hidden even in plain sight. Organizations working to combat domestic violence used her story to educate young women about the warning signs of controlling relationships, emphasizing the importance of maintaining connections to family and friends who can provide perspective and support. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerabilities that young women face in age-gap relationships, leading to important conversations about consent, power imbalances, and the grooming of vulnerable teenagers. Advocacy groups used Carolina's story to push for stronger legal protections for young people in romantic relationships, with significantly older partners arguing that existing consent laws were inadequate to address the psychological manipulation that often occurs in such situations. Educational institutions across Greece and beyond incorporated Caroline's case into their curricula, using her story to teach students about healthy relationships, domestic violence warning signs, and the importance of seeking help when relationships become controlling or abusive. The case became a powerful tool for reaching young people who might otherwise dismiss domestic violence education as irrelevant to their lives. The Greek Orthodox Church, which had blessed Caroline and Bobas's marriage, also underwent significant reflection and reform in response to the case. Religious leaders recognized that their institution had played a role in validating a relationship that was fundamentally problematic, leading to new protocols for premarital counseling that specifically address issues of age differences, power imbalances, and healthy relationship dynamics. The church began training clergy to recognize signs of controlling or abusive relationships and developed resources to help young parishioners understand the characteristics of healthy partnerships. Carolina's case became a catalyst for broader conversations within religious communities about their responsibility to protect vulnerable individuals from predatory relationships. The legal system also evolved in response to the case, with prosecutors and judges receiving additional training in domestic violence, dynamics, and the psychology of abusive relationships. The case demonstrated how domestic violence cases could be far more complex than they initially appeared, requiring investigators and legal professionals to understand the sophisticated methods that abusers use to control their victims and evade accountability. New legislation was proposed and enacted to strengthen protections for domestic violence victims, including improved emergency response procedures, enhanced training for first responders, and better coordination between law enforcement and social services. The case highlighted gaps in existing systems that had failed to protect Caroline despite warning signs that were apparent in retrospect. The international attention that Caroline's case received also led to important cross-cultural conversations about domestic violence, particularly regarding how different societies address age-gap relationships and the protection of young women. The case became a focal point for discussions about cultural relativism versus universal human rights, with advocates arguing that Caroline's story demonstrated the need for consistent international standards for protecting vulnerable individuals. Mental health professionals also studied the case extensively, using it to better understand the psychology of domestic abusers and the sophisticated methods they use to maintain control over their victims. Bobas's ability to maintain his deception for more than a month while under intense scrutiny provided valuable insights into the mindset of narcissistic abusers and their capacity for manipulation. The case contributed to the development of new therapeutic approaches for domestic violence survivors, particularly those who have experienced psychological abuse and isolation. Caroline's diary entries, which documented her internal struggle between love and recognition of abuse, helped therapists better understand the complex emotions that keep victims trapped in dangerous relationships. Research institutions began studying the case as an example of how domestic violence intersects with other forms of criminal behavior, particularly the willingness of abusers to commit additional crimes to maintain that control or avoid accountability. The elaborate nature of Babas's deception, including his willingness to let innocent people be pursued for his crime, provided insights into the moral bankruptcy that can accompany severe domestic abuse. Caroline's daughter, now being raised by her maternal grandparents, became a symbol of resilience and hope in a story marked by tragedy and deception. Her care and protection became a community responsibility, with Greek society rallying to ensure that she would have the support and resources necessary to overcome the trauma of her early life. The childess situation also sparked important conversations about the rights and needs of children whose parents commit serious crimes. Legal experts and child welfare advocates used her case to push for better protocols for handling such situations, ensuring that children are protected from ongoing trauma while receiving age-appropriate information about their family history. As the years passed, Carolina's story continued to serve as a powerful reminder of the hidden nature of domestic violence and the sophisticated methods that modern abusers can use to maintain control over their victims. Her case became a touchstone for advocates, educators, law enforcement professionals, and mental health experts working to prevent similar tragedies. The legacy of Caroline Crouch extends far beyond the specific circumstances of her murder. Her story became a catalyst for meaningful change in how society addresses domestic violence, investigates complex crimes, and protects vulnerable young women from predatory relationships. The case demonstrated that even the most sophisticated deceptions can ultimately be exposed by careful investigation, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved. Caroline's diary entries, preserved as evidence in the case, provided a voice for countless other victims of domestic abuse who might otherwise remain silent. Her words, documenting the internal struggle between love and recognition of abuse, help society better understand the complex psychology that keeps victims trapped in dangerous relationships, and the courage required to seek escape. The international attention that her case received ensured that Carolina's story would continue to educate and inspire people around the world, serving as both a warning about the dangers of controlling relationships and a testament to the importance of never giving up the search for truth and justice. Her legacy lives on in the enhanced protections for domestic violence victims, the improved investigative techniques used by law enforcement, and the increased awareness of the signs of abusive relationships among young people who might otherwise find themselves in similar situations. Caroline Crouch's story reminds us that behind every statistic about domestic violence is a real person with dreams, hopes, and the fundamental right to live free from fear and control. Her tragic death was not in vain if it prevents even one other young woman from falling victim to a similar predator, or if it helps one more person recognize the warning signs and seek help before it is too late. In that sense, Caroline's voice continues to speak, warning others of dangers she could not escape herself, and her legacy continues to protect the vulnerable long after her own life was cut short.